I promised myself when I first walked through the double doors of that rehab center in Missouri that I would keep my head down and do whatever it took to survive. I wasn't proud of where I had ended up. No one checks themselves into rehab because life is going smoothly. I had made mistakes, big ones, ugly ones, but deep down I believed I was still human, still worthy of a chance to put myself back together. What I didn't know then was that while I was fighting for my life on the inside, my own son was out there tearing apart what little foundation I had left. I should explain. Rehab isn't just about drying out. It isn't just about the chemicals in your blood being flushed out. It's about being stripped down until there's nothing left between you and your worst memories. They make you talk about the things you swore you'd never admit to anyone. They push you into group sessions where other broken souls pick at your scars, because they're desperate to make sense of their own. And when you cry, you don't do it quietly in the dark of your bedroom. You cry in front of strangers, in sterile white rooms that smell faintly of disinfectant and stale coffee. My son promised me before I checked in that he'd take care of the house. He looked me in the eyes I once kissed goodnight when he was a boy, and swore he'd handle everything. The bills, the upkeep, the mailbox, the little repairs. Don't worry about it, Mom, he said. Just get better. I clung to those words like a life raft. Because that house wasn't just wood and drywall. That house was my history. Every Christmas morning, every fight with my husband in the kitchen, every birthday cake that ever collapsed in the oven, it was all there, in those walls. It was the last thing that felt truly mine. The first few weeks in rehab were brutal. My body shook with withdrawal so bad I thought my bones might snap. Some nights I couldn't keep food down, other nights I sweated through my sheets, gripping the mattress like it might keep me from slipping into the abyss. But little by little, I started to feel something like clarity again. I wrote letters I never sent. I confessed sins to a journal I never meant anyone to read. I spoke truths to my group that had been rotting in me for years. Rehab was hell, but it was also the first place in decades where I wasn't lying to myself. And through it all, I held onto one picture in my mind, me walking back through the front door of my house when it was all over. Putting water on for coffee. Pulling a blanket off the back of the sofa. Sitting there in silence, in a home that was still mine. But when I got out, that door wasn't there. I'll never forget the day. It was gray, late autumn. The air smelled like wet leaves and diesel exhaust from trucks on the highway. My son picked me up from the center, cheerful enough, though a little too distracted. He didn't hug me the way he used to. His hands fidgeted on the steering wheel. His phone buzzed on the console, and he kept glancing at it like he couldn't wait to be somewhere else. I thought it was just nerves. I thought maybe seeing me sober scared him, because now we'd actually have to deal with the mess between us. But when he pulled up in front of my house, or what used to be my house, I realized it wasn't nerves. It was guilt. The for sale sign had been yanked from the yard, but the paint around the post still scarred the grass. New blinds hung in the front windows. A stranger's car was parked in the driveway. I stared. My chest went tight. For a second I thought maybe I was in the wrong neighborhood, that maybe he'd taken a wrong turn. But then I saw the old oak tree out front, the one with the limb that curved just enough for me to hang a swing on when he was a boy. My tree, my yard, my home, gone. What is this? I asked, my voice hoarse. He didn't answer right away. He just drummed his fingers against the wheel and exhaled hard through his nose. Finally, he said, Mom, listen, it was just sitting there. The market's been crazy. I got a great offer, and I didn't let him finish. My hands flew to the door handle. I stumbled out onto the sidewalk, my knees weak, my throat burning like I'd swallowed fire. You sold it, I screamed. My voice cracked, but the rage in it was louder than any thunderstorm I'd ever heard. You sold my house. He climbed out after me, his face tight, his mouth a hard line. Mom, you weren't even there. You were in rehab. You didn't need a house sitting empty, rotting away. I thought I was helping you. Now you've got money. You can start fresh. Money. Start fresh. He made it sound like a gift, like betrayal could be wrapped in a bow and handed over like a bouquet of flowers. I wanted to hit him. God help me, I wanted to. But my hands just trembled in the cold air, and all I could do was stare at him like I didn't even recognize him anymore. This was the boy I carried for 9 months. The boy I fed, clothed, defended when his father lost his temper. This was the boy who once told me he'd never let anything bad happen to me. The worst part was, he didn't even look sorry. I don't remember much else about that night. I know I ended up in a cheap motel room, sitting on the edge of a bedspread that smelled like cigarette ash and mildew. I know I cried until my throat went raw. I know I punched the mirror in the bathroom until the skin on my knuckles split. But what I remember most is the silence after. The kind of silence that doesn't just hang in the air, it presses down on you, heavy and merciless. That was the night I buried whatever pieces of me were left that still believed in forgiveness. That was the night I swore I wouldn't just survive, I'd make sure my son learned what it felt like to have everything ripped away. Because if rehab taught me anything, it's that the only way out of hell is through fire. And I still had plenty of fire left in me. When people talk about hitting rock bottom, they don't always tell you what it really feels like. They make it sound almost noble, like a place where epiphanies bloom and second chances are born. But that's a lie. Rock bottom isn't some dramatic moment of clarity. It's quiet. It's humiliating. It's the sound of your stomach growling in a room you don't own, in a bed that smells like other people's sweat. It's realizing that the only thing that still belongs to you is your own name, and even that feels stained. After the night I found out my son sold my house, I drifted. Motel to motel, couch to couch, sometimes just a blanket in the back of a stranger's car when kindness ran out. I was clean, but I wasn't living. Rehab had purged the poisons from my veins, but it hadn't given me back my dignity. And now my son had stolen the last piece of security I thought I could count on. The first week, I kept trying to convince myself it was a misunderstanding. I told myself maybe he'd put the money aside for me, maybe he had some plan that I couldn't see yet. But when I asked him, his answers were sharp, defensive, full of excuses about bills and opportunities. He treated me like a burden, like the sale of my home was an act of mercy instead of betrayal. The truth sat in my gut like a stone, he hadn't done it for me. He'd done it for himself. I would lie awake at night thinking about that house, the way the morning light filtered through the lace curtains in the kitchen, the squeak of the third step on the staircase, the dent in the hallway wall from the time he threw a baseball indoors. Every detail was etched into my bones. And yet now some stranger was brushing their teeth in my bathroom, cooking eggs in my skillet, walking barefoot on my hardwood floors. It was like being erased. I walked past once, just to see. The new family had painted the shutters blue. There were toys scattered in the yard, little pink bikes tipped over on the grass. I stood across the street, hidden by the branches of the oak tree, and I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. I didn't belong there anymore. The anger came slow at first, like embers glowing under ash. But the more I thought about it, the hotter it burned. Anger is different when it's directed at blood. When a stranger screws you, you curse, you spit, and you move on. But when it's your own child, the betrayal digs deeper, cutting into places you didn't even know were vulnerable. I thought about the years I spent working 2 jobs to keep food on the table. I thought about the nights I stayed up with him when he had fevers, rocking him in a chair until dawn. I thought about the times I defended him against teachers who said he was trouble, the times I lied to his father to protect him from punishment. And for what? So he could take everything from me the moment I couldn't fight back. That fury kept me alive in those empty nights. One evening, sitting outside a diner with a paper cup of coffee gone cold in my hands, I heard 2 men talking about my son. I didn't know them, but I recognized the name of his business, the company he'd built in town after dropping out of college. They were complaining about him, about how he overcharged, how he cut corners, how he thought he was invincible. That was the first time I realized he had something worth losing. I started paying attention after that, listening when people mentioned him, watching where his trucks went, who his employees were, which bars he hung around. My anger sharpened into curiosity, and curiosity into something darker, intent. I wasn't stupid. I knew I couldn't walk into his office and demand back what he'd taken from me. That house was gone, and no amount of screaming would bring it back. But what I could do was balance the scale. He had taken from me the one thing that gave me safety. I would take from him the one thing that gave him pride. Some nights, I questioned myself. I'd lie awake in another borrowed bed, staring at a cracked ceiling, and ask if I was really prepared to go down that road. Revenge is heavy, and it eats at you the same way addiction does. But every time doubt crept in, I'd picture the look on his face that day in the driveway, the way he stood tall, unflinching, convinced he was right. That arrogance was my fuel. I started small. I got a part-time job at a hardware store not far from where his workers came for supplies. I didn't tell them who I was. Anonymity became my armor. I'd listen while they griped about late paychecks, about cheap materials, about my son cutting corners to save a buck. I filed every detail away in my mind. It amazed me how easily people talk when they don't know who's listening. Within weeks, I knew which of his employees hated him, which suppliers he owed money to, which contracts he was struggling to fulfill. I learned his weaknesses like I once learned his bedtime routines. And with every secret I collected, the fury inside me grew steadier, sharper, more dangerous. One night, sitting in the quiet corner of a laundromat while my clothes spun in the dryer, I pulled out a notebook I'd bought from the dollar store. On the first page, I wrote in big letters, "He took my house. I will take his business." It wasn't just anger anymore. It was a plan. That night, for the first time since rehab, I felt a sense of power hum through my veins. The same kind of electricity I used to feel when I lit up a cigarette after a long shift, or when I poured myself a glass of whiskey to silence the noise in my head. But this high was different. It was clean. It wasn't something I swallowed or smoked. It was something I created. The fury that once threatened to burn me alive had transformed into something else, a weapon. And I was ready to use it. I remember the first time she walked into his office like it was a private sin she'd confessed to me in the dark. Not because she wanted anyone's pity, she never did, but because she needed someone to anchor the story, to hold it steady so it wouldn't tumble into something she couldn't manage alone. I had met her in the clinic, the two of us surviving the same brutal haze. She was older than most of the people in our group, hair a silver that trembled at the edges, skin with the map of a life. She told me her story once, in fragments, and I promised, quietly, without ceremony, to keep listening. That night in the motel after the sale of her house had become public, she leaned her forehead against the window and said something I'll never forget. "He thinks a mother is a thing you can sell," she said. Like I was a lamp on a table. Her hands were small and strong in the lamplight, and I could see the way her knuckles flexed when she formed the words. There was a love there that didn't mean surrender. There was a fury that had been repurposed for calculation. She didn't storm his office in some melodramatic scene. That wasn't her style. She had been beaten down enough to know that thunder and optics didn't win real wars. She wanted precision. She wanted to learn his world the way one studies a chessboard, every piece, every weakness, every predictable habit. That's why chapter 3 is really where everything begins to change. It started slow. She knew how to be invisible in a room full of wind. She found a job that let her be near him without drawing attention, the diner 2 blocks from his office. The waitress with the tired smile asked questions she didn't have to answer. She asked for coffee refills, held doors, and pretended to be the kind of woman who had always loved pie more than property. People don't look twice when an old woman is sweeping under tables, they assume she's been there for years. From the diner she could watch his routine. The morning he'd come in, late and jittery. The men who came with him, different types, bullies turned nervous around their boss, and veterans of his little empire who respected the name he'd built. She wrote their faces down in a notebook. Small obsessions add up. She watched which cars parked outside his building and which trucks left in the afternoon. She memorized license plates the way some women memorize recipes. Her mind, sharpened by pain and fueled by righteous fury, turned into a tool. She started to work on one of the things rehab hadn't fixed, her confidence. Years of being taken for granted had corroded something vital. Now she rebuilt it like a carpenter restoring a floor. She practiced the tone she would use, the softness that hides steel. Inside his business, she uncovered a world that was messier and smaller than she'd imagined. He'd branded it big, a name on a truck, a slick website, the sort of logo you see once and then never again until you need their service. But businesses are like lives. From a distance they look polished. Up close, they carry the smell of nervousness, the duct tape of corner cutting, the stain of unpaid debts. She discovered accounts that hadn't been reconciled in months, invoices missing signatures, vendors who took his calls only when his checks cleared. The arrogance she'd seen in his face translated into carelessness, and that's where she found the doorway. She didn't go to the bank with threats. She learned where the papers were filed. She learned who the accountant was and what kind of woman could be moved with the right story. She befriended the receptionist first, a young gal with a browsed history of bad luck. The receptionist liked that she had a soft laugh and didn't ask prying questions. People confide in the ones who make them feel lighter. It's a trick as old as gossip. From the receptionist she learned about payroll cycles and the quiet men who carried cash at the end of the week. From a dishwasher at the diner she learned that one of his foremen kept different books in a shoebox at home. She made friends with small things and received big answers like gifts. It was in the quiet of a Saturday afternoon that she found the first real opening. He had a client, a modest homeowner needing emergency repairs after a storm, who complained that the job had been botched. The homeowner posted about it on a local social feed and her saw the post through an account she'd created under a different name. The piece read like a confession, photos of sloppy work, half-finished edges, nails where screws should have been. She used that post, politely and from a distance, to contact the homeowner and offer help. Not charity, counsel. She went, met the homeowner, fixed what needed fixing, and left the man with the sort of gratitude that's spoken loudly in front of neighbors. Word travels fast in small towns. People tell their sisters, their coworkers, and sometimes people tell the one they trust most. In this way she built a reputation quietly as someone who could make things right. But she didn't stop with goodwill. She began to build leverage. When the accountant made a mistake on payroll one month, she was there to notice it. When a vendor grumbled about invoices, she was there to listen. She slipped into the cracks with the ease of someone who had nothing to lose. And in that slipping, in the late-night conversations, the sympathetic nods, the shared cigarettes outside shuttered stores, she harvested information that was raw and valuable. People underestimate how much damage curiosity can do when it's aimed and patient. She used curiosity like a crowbar, opening doors he thought were locked. There were nights she'd sit on a bench beneath a street lamp and run scenarios in her head until the paper in her notebook was full. She planned the rhythm of a takeover like an orchestra conductor, a measure here, a crescendo there. She made spreadsheets of names and risks, the kind of habit that had once kept track of her grocery lists. She balanced potential gains against probable losses. Revenge, she understood, isn't poetic. It's logistics. She learned the moral economy of his employees. People there were not monsters. Most were decent, tired men trying to keep themselves from sliding. He used threats and charm in equal measure. He promised promotions and then cut hours. He bought loyalty with words more than with cash. There were grumbling resentments that she could fan and pockets of fierce loyalty that would take more than whispering to move. Her first gambit was subtle. She paid attention to the ones who were already slipping, the ones who complained about pay or product. Those men were seeds ready to be planted with the right fertilizer. One of the most important things she discovered, the real currency beyond invoices, was his ego. He had built a public persona of a self-made man, the son who had pulled himself loose of a messy past to become a success. Wherever cloth meets fire, hubris becomes brittle. He was sloppy with his pride in ways that made him vulnerable. He would walk into a meeting thinking his name would close the deal, he'd forget to read the fine print. He trusted the illusion of power more than the work to back it up. Her plan, once it hardened in her mind, had two parts, persuasion and exposure. If she could get the right people to believe that his ship was listing, they would either jump or be shoved. And if his ship listed, clients would notice. Clients that once preferred his brand for its shiny truck and name would now look for those who could do the work properly. She started with clients. She introduced herself as an independent contractor who offered oversight and quality checks. She offered to evaluate any job where the homeowners felt shortchanged, and she did so free of charge at first. The kindness was a mask for an inspection. She made lists of corners he'd cut, of materials he'd substituted, of estimates padded to skim profit. She photographed shoddy seams and saved conversations. She became the woman who could corroborate complaints with evidence. When she had a handful of cases, she met with the local small claims lawyer under yet another borrowed name. She learned how easy it was to file a complaint with the right documentation. She learned what the court actually demanded of contractors and which types of infractions were most damaging in the public eye. She didn't want to send her son to prison. She wanted to take something from him that he couldn't rebuild easily, his reputation. There's a particular cruelty in destroying someone's public self. Some people measure worth by the shape of their name in others' mouths. She'd seen men like that. She had been a woman like that once, measured by social gatherings and how clean her curtains hung. She understood, clinically, where his pride sat, and she aimed there. But even as she plotted, she never lost the threads of who she used to be, the one who loved baking in the old kitchen, the one who had once tucked a sleeping child's hair behind his ear. Her actions had a tenderness threaded through them, not for him but for what he'd stolen. When she pulled a man out of a bad job by offering him employment under better, more honest terms, she felt both the warmth of rightness and the cold sting of power. She wanted not to break him but to redirect his energy to something honorable, if he'd accept it. Most of the time, he refused. Pride is a stubborn weed. I watched her change. The woman who had entered my life with trembling hands now moved like someone who understood the currency of small deeds. She had patience and the willingness to be unnoticed. She had learned that violence isn't always a fist, sometimes it's a ledger. And yet, she was not immune to the hunger that revenge brings. There were nights she came to me furious, hands shaking, telling me stories about the way his men laughed when he told the same joke twice, or the way he'd park his truck on the curb like a king staking his territory. She wanted to be brutal, to shatter him into something tiny. I held her then, not as a nod to softness but because even the fiercest of us need human contact. Her plan took shape when she secured a small group of allies who'd been sick of being used. There was a foreman who had been promised a promotion and then passed over for a younger kid who knew how to flatter. There was an accountant who'd discovered missing funds and shrugged them off until the numbers hurt his conscience. There was a supplier whose invoices had been bounced one too many times. Each person had a ledger of grievances, and she knew how to stitch those ledgers into a letter that could do damage. She didn't rely only on anger. She used bureaucratic choke points, the kind that exist in every town: permits, licenses, regulatory inspections. She learned which permits required updated insurance and which ones required a local contractor's stamp. She found a small procedural fault in one of his applications, a missing signature, a requirement overlooked because he'd paid for speed, and she lodged a complaint. That complaint was procedural, it didn't need malice to be effective. It was the town's way of saying, if you can't follow the rules, you can't play. It is a strange thing to watch a man who has convinced himself he is untouchable begin to age in the public's eye while you stand on the sidelines and hold a cup of weak diner coffee. You expect fireworks, but most of the time the change is slow and undignified. A missed meeting, a delayed invoice, a social media post that invites ridicule, these are the tiny cuts that accumulate into something fatal. By the end of 6 months, she had done what she set out to do. She had gathered proof, built alliances, and lined up the machinery of exposure. She had become a woman who could move among the town's underappreciated and uplift the story that mattered. What she didn't know then, and what none of us could predict, was how skewed the scales would become once the first domino fell. She had expected resistance, lawsuits, tears. She had not expected the way small-town sympathy would sometimes tilt to the side of the underdog, or how sometimes the underdog becomes the villain in his own story. There is an art to what she did next, an art that had nothing to do with malice and everything to do with economy. She named and documented, she presented and waited, she let the town do the rest. Reputation is a fragile thing. Once a doubt is planted, it grows in the silence between neighbors. In the weeks that followed, small claims hearings came with the scrape of folding chairs and the low hum of whispers. Vendors stopped taking his calls. The foreman she'd befriended refused to follow orders that involved cutting corners. A few clients, angry and validated, posted their photos and their bills like a chorus. He tried to fight back with bluster. He hired a lawyer with a quick smile and an expensive suit. But law needs time, and time is the one thing on her side. I told you this so you'd know how she learned his world. She didn't win a battle with a single swing. She started a structural collapse by removing the rotten beam and watching the house settle unevenly until the people inside noticed the tilt. Her patience and method were the kind of cold planning that grows out of necessity. She was not a villain, and she was not a saint. She was a woman who had been robbed and had decided, logically and with terrible grace, to take back what she could. When the first official complaint went up on the bulletin board at City Hall, when a client's photograph of poor workmanship hit the local feed with a caption that named his company, I saw how small things can become large. The town is a network of voices. A few voices, raised with evidence, can change the chorus. We both knew then that the real contest was beginning. The son, the man who had sold a mother's house for a profit he thought would free him, was about to find out how much a reputation mattered in a place where everyone knows everyone else's history. And she, who had once known the pride of cleaning and the shame of being taken for granted, would have to watch the things she had cultivated become a weapon. There is a compassion in her actions I won't sugarcoat. She wanted him to change. She wanted him to learn. But compassion is not always gentle. Sometimes it must be exacting. She closed the notebook one night, hands trembling with the fatigue of a long-fought week, and said simply, if I'm going to take his business, I'll have to do it without enemy fire hitting the innocent. That, more than anything, showed me who she truly was, a woman who had been brutalized by life and turned the brutality into strategy rather than fury alone. That's how she learned his world, with patience, the careful collection of facts, and a steady hand on a small notebook. She had become a quiet force. And the town, which thrives on small stories, was beginning to listen. I had lived my life being stepped on. My son had proven that blood means nothing when greed takes over. Selling my house while I was clawing my way out of rehab was one betrayal, but taking my dignity, leaving me to rot, that was something deeper. By the time I was ready to strike, I had already mastered one thing that rehab had drilled into me: patience. See, an addict learns all about craving and impulse. You want the hit, the drink, the escape now. But in recovery, you learn to sit with the itch. You learn to let the hunger claw at your insides while you stare it down. That was how I approached my son's business. I didn't rush. I let the rage burn low, steady, like coals under iron. My son's business wasn't much from the outside, just another mid-sized operation in Missouri that traded on a mix of charm and cheap labor. But I knew the bones of it because I had raised the boy. His weaknesses were mine once. His arrogance, his shortcuts, his lazy reliance on trust, that came straight from my bloodline. And what better way to bring him down than to use what he inherited from me against him? I started small. Always start small. A whisper here, a favor there. I picked up work cleaning offices around town, sometimes right under his nose. Nobody looked twice at an old woman wiping down counters. Invisible, that was my gift. They talked around me as if I wasn't there, spilling stories about shipments that never arrived on time, about clients who were starting to doubt his reliability. I listened, collected details like coins, and tucked them away. His employees weren't loyal. Why would they be? He paid them late, talked down to them, took their efforts for granted. So I became the ear they needed. One night at a local dive bar, I overheard two of his warehouse guys complaining about being stiffed on overtime. I bought them around, cheap whiskey, but it loosened their tongues. By the end of the night, I had their trust. By the end of the month, they were feeding me schedules, invoices, little cracks in the armor of his empire. But whispers and gossip weren't enough. I needed leverage, so I went after his clients. The trick was simple: undercut and outperform. His arrogance left room for someone like me to swoop in. Through an old acquaintance from rehab, yes, even broken people can be valuable, I got introduced to a supplier who hated dealing with my son. Too slow to pay, too quick to talk big without delivering. I offered something different: prompt payment, clear communication, and respect. Respect, imagine that. It cost me nothing but words, but it bought me doors into rooms he had locked tight. One by one, the dominoes began to fall. At first, he didn't notice. He thought the world still revolved around his swagger. But then he started missing calls, losing contracts, watching longtime customers drift away. And there I was, standing in the shadows, catching every piece as it fell. The sweetest part wasn't the money, though I won't lie, watching the numbers climb felt like water to a thirsty throat. No, the sweetest part was watching him squirm. Watching his arrogance crack, his voice rise in panic when deals slipped through his fingers. He didn't even suspect it was me. His own mother, the woman he had abandoned, was the ghost dismantling his kingdom brick by brick. And then came the sabotage. I didn't need to swing a hammer or smash windows. That's amateur revenge. Mine was quieter, cleaner. I altered records, small adjustments, nothing dramatic at first. Wrong dates on shipments. Wrong addresses on invoices. His own sloppy systems made it easy. He'd never invested in real oversight. Soon his clients were calling him unreliable. Trucks showed up empty. Payments went missing. His reputation, the lifeblood of any business, bled out slowly, drip by drip. By the time he realized something was wrong, I already had his key clients in my pocket. He'd burned those bridges long ago. I just salted the earth. But I wasn't done. Oh no, revenge is hollow if it only leaves ashes. I wanted something that would make him feel what I had felt. That bone-deep betrayal, that sense of having the ground yanked from beneath you. So I went for his pride. He loved nothing more than flashing his success around town. The cars, the dinners, the women hanging on his arm, he wore it all like armor. So I stripped it piece by piece. I whispered into the right ears: wives, investors, competitors. I made sure the cracks in his facade showed under the brightest lights. Suddenly, he wasn't the golden boy anymore. He was the man fumbling for excuses while others shook their heads in disappointment. It wasn't just business. It was social execution. I remember the night he finally realized he was ruined. I was across the street, sitting in a borrowed car, watching through the neon glow of a bar window. He sat hunched over, head in his hands, phone buzzing endlessly on the table beside him. Nobody came to sit with him. Nobody offered him a drink. The empire he had stolen from me, built on the ashes of my home, was crumbling in silence. And me, I didn't smile, I didn't cheer. Revenge isn't about joy, it's about balance. And that night, the scales finally tipped in my favor. Still, I wasn't foolish enough to think this would end clean. Men like my son don't go down quietly. They claw, they bite, they beg. And that was fine with me. Because I had spent years learning to live with hunger. And I wasn't done feeding yet. Silence is an underrated weapon. After years of chaos, rehab, betrayal, the rage that ate at me like rust, I found comfort in the quiet. By the time my son's business was ash in his hands, I had stopped needing the noise of revenge to fuel me. The damage was done, the balance restored, and the echoes of his arrogance faded into nothing. But don't mistake silence for weakness. My silence was deliberate, calculated, the kind of silence that lets a storm pass while the ground remains flooded. My son didn't even know it was me. That was the beauty of it. He looked everywhere for the culprit, competitors, ex-partners, jealous friends, but never once did his suspicion settle on the woman who had given him life. His own mother. And why would it? In his mind, I was weak. I was the one who needed saving, the one who had stumbled into rehab broken and ashamed. He thought I was too busy nursing regrets to ever rise again. He underestimated me the way men underestimate silence, assuming it means absence, not power. The truth is, I didn't just take his business. I took his peace. Let me explain. When I stripped away his clients, his reputation, his money, I left him with nothing but questions. And questions eat at a man more than loss. He sat in bars with his head in his hands, replaying deals, searching for mistakes, trying to figure out where it all went wrong. He blamed partners, blamed timing, blamed fate, but never himself. And that blindness was the final nail in his coffin. Because here's the thing, you can recover from failure if you understand it. You can rebuild if you learn from it. But if you don't even know who your enemy is, you'll keep drowning in the same shallow waters. My son will never rise again, not because I ruined him, but because he doesn't know how he was ruined. That was my true revenge. Not the money, not the power, the ignorance. Do I feel guilty? People expect me to. Society tells mothers to forgive, to endure, to love without question. But guilt belongs to those who act without reason. My reasons were carved into my bones the day I stepped out of rehab and realized my home, my sanctuary, was gone. Sold by the very boy I carried, fed, and protected. That betrayal wasn't just financial. It was spiritual. He severed something between us, and once it was cut, it could never be tied. I learned in those days that love and hate are cousins. They live close together. You can flip them like a coin with the smallest betrayal. And when my son flipped that coin, it landed in my hands as hate. Cold, steady, righteous hate. So no, I don't feel guilty. I feel free. When the dust settled, I had options. I could have taken the business fully, signed my name where his once was, built an empire of my own. I had the connections, the contracts, the trust he had squandered. But I didn't. I didn't need the spotlight. I didn't crave the applause. I wasn't chasing glory. I chose silence. Instead, I pulled back. I let others step into the roles I had carved open. Partners who had been slighted by him now thrived with the opportunities I had delivered. Workers he had underpaid now found fair hands to work under. I drifted quietly into the background, with just enough wealth tucked away to live comfortably. Nobody knew the truth. Not the clients, not the workers, not even the whispers in town. And that's how I wanted it. Anonymity is the sharpest blade. If nobody knows you exist, they can't stop you, can't accuse you, can't punish you. I became a ghost in Missouri, the kind that doesn't haunt with rattling chains but with quiet satisfaction. Even now, as I speak these words to you, I remain nameless. You don't know my face, and you never will. That's how I protect myself, and, in a twisted way, that's how I protect him. If I named myself, I'd be naming him. I'd be dragging him through the mud in public, and though he deserves every ounce of it, I don't need to. He already lives in the private hell I built for him. You may wonder, what about family? What about the others, my husband, my kin? Did they know? Did they suspect? No, and that's the way it had to be. He wasn't caught by his father. He wasn't exposed at family dinners. Nobody saw the blood in the water but me. I carried it alone, wore the mask of an ordinary woman, while inside I was something sharper, colder, more dangerous. That's why I'm anonymous. Not because I fear judgment, but because anonymity preserves the sanctity of my revenge. It keeps the story pure. Here's what I've learned. 1. Betrayal doesn't come from enemies. It comes from those closest to you. Strangers can't hurt you the way family can. 2. Rehab taught me more than sobriety. It taught me patience, clarity, and the strength to channel pain into purpose. 3. Silence is a weapon. Shouting makes you a target. Whispering makes you dangerous. 4. Revenge isn't about justice. It's about balance. About making the world feel as uneven to them as it did to you. And maybe the cruelest truth of all, sometimes, blood is just blood. It doesn't guarantee loyalty. It doesn't guarantee love. I don't tell you this story for pity. I don't want your tears or your applause. I tell it because somewhere out there, another soul is staring down betrayal, wondering if they can survive it. And the answer is yes. Not only can you survive it, you can sharpen it into something powerful. I survived. I struck back. And now, I live in silence, comfortable, unafraid, unashamed. My son, he walks through town a broken man, still searching for answers he'll never find. Every time his phone rings, every time a deal slips away, he wonders who is against him. He looks over his shoulder, but he never looks at me. That's my victory, and that is why I stay anonymous. Because my story isn't about being seen. It's about what can be done when you decide you've had enough. This is my true story, from Missouri. And now it's yours to carry. This has been the raw and unfiltered true story of a mother from Missouri, betrayed by her own son, stripped of her home while fighting for her life in rehab, only to rise from the ashes and take back her power in silence. What began as heartbreak turned into a calculated act of survival and revenge. She didn't just lose everything, she proved that even in the face of betrayal, resilience, patience, and determination can carve a path toward justice. Her story reminds us that betrayal often comes from those closest to us, but silence and strategy can be stronger than anger and noise. She chose anonymity not out of fear, but as a final act of power, leaving her son broken and searching for answers he will never find. From family betrayal to revenge and survival, this story shows that sometimes the quietest victories are the most devastating. If you've been moved by this story, there are many more tales of love, betrayal, resilience, and hidden truths waiting to be told. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel, hit the notification bell, and stay connected. Every week we bring you true stories and real confessions that will shock you, inspire you, and make you see life differently. Subscribe now and never miss the next story. You won't believe what's coming next. Disclaimer: this story is based on a true life confession shared anonymously. Names, places, and some details may be changed for privacy. It is intended for a mature audience only. Viewer discretion is advised.